Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for being here today. How many folks is this the first time you've been to Assemble? There's some half and half maybe. So, well, welcome to Assemble. Nina Barbuto, who is running around here, she's in the back raising her hand. She is the woman who makes this happen with many, many others at her side. So it's a wonderful space for community and technology and arts, and there's lots of programming that happens here all the time, and we're glad to be here today because Assemble is a great example of a network member, and this is a Kids and Creativity Lunch and Learn. So Kids and Creativity, as many of you know, is an interdisciplinary group of folks that are working to reimagine and remake education all around southwestern Pennsylvania. So we're pleased to be here at Assemble, and we're excited to hear from Illah Nourbakhsh, who runs the Create Lab. And to give you a bit of an intro, just on May 17th, there was a review of his latest book, Robot Futures, in the Washington Post. This is Stephen Levingston writing. I get the sense that Nourbakhsh, though apparently still human, has gone over to the robot side. Indeed, he has fathered quite a few, including a 7-foot-tall tour guide for the Carnegie Museum of Natural History, and a super pogo stick that rockets riders ridiculously high into the air. He's developed three-dimensional robotic vision and devised a navigational strategy that helps robots wander indoors without getting lost. Nourbakhsh, who leads a lab at Carnegie Mellon University devoted to advancing human-robot interaction, gave us a hint of where the world is headed as co-author of an earlier book, Introduction to Autonomous Mobile Robots. In Robot Futures, he reveals the social forces and technology propelling us toward a robotic, enhanced life that turns a sensitive eye on the complex human issues that lie ahead. So, if that isn't intriguing enough, which I think it is, we're excited to learn more about that today. So with that, allow me to introduce Illah for our conversation.
Thank you, Dustin. Well, thank you for the introduction. That was kind to read part of the review. It's an interesting review because I think he read enough of the book that he thought I'm really pro-robot. And he didn't read the part of the book that says, oh no, socially dystopian future is awaiting us unless we do something different. So it's a very optimistic view that his review gives, and people who read the book with that science fiction sense in their mentality will be sorely disappointed by the time they get to the final chapter, as they discover that what I'm saying is that there's a whole lot of social dangers awaiting us in robotics. So it's a pleasure to be here. This is sort of a talk that's new for me, and I'm excited to give it. I gave a talk here about the book a couple of weeks ago, and really enjoyed that. And the hospitality that Assemble has shown to create for the entire month of May has been tremendous. So we are incredibly excited about this experiment of May. This talk is about Kids and Creativity, which is an incredibly powerful network in Pittsburgh, and probably a model for something that will grow into other urban areas over the next decade or so. But in particular, I was interested in talking a little to the idea of where Kids and Creativity will be in the year 2020. Now, 2020 is a funny year to start with. Usually science fiction folks give you a year when they're either dead or retired, so you can't come back and haunt them with the fact that their predictions were wrong. 2020 is only 6 years away, so it's not that far away. So what I'm saying isn't incredibly mind-bending in terms of suggesting a crazy future. But it is an attempt to say where technology, I honestly believe, will be in a mere 6 years. And what impact that has either on what Kids and Creativity will mean in 2020 or what it ought to mean if we're going to make a difference in that future world that we're going to occupy. Now, the reason that I'm giving this talk is the same as the reason that I wrote the book. And I want to explain that a little bit. Because if you look at the press on robotics or on technology, it is thoroughly optimistic in general, especially from people who are coming from an academic background or a technological background in companies. They talk about how technology will make your world a better place. They talk about how Google Glasses will invigorate your life in more satisfying and rich ways, right? All the conversations that you see, all those fluents and tropes that you'll detect are about this idea of technology as a positive social good. The reason I wrote the book is because, in fact, the trajectory that I see in front of us vis-a-vis technology that's interactive, like robots, like mobile devices, has significant negative influences on our life. It has social dystopian tendencies. And yet you don't see people talking technically about that in technically fluent ways. You see Fringe talk about that. And in fact, what's odd is you'll see the core technologically fluent people talk about things like the singularity, where they suggest that we will merge with our machines and become immortal through them. And yes, I've had lunch with billionaires who believe in the singularity, and I've asked them, so do you really believe that you're going to be immortal? And the answer is yes, they do. And that affects everything about the way they live, the risks they take, and the way they invest their money, because they honestly believe they're going to merge with machines and become immortal. Now, to the rest of us who don't believe that, that presents an odd situation, where if nothing else, a singularity poses that there's even more balkanization of opinion about what life is and what our identity on Earth is about. If some set of us think they're living forever and some set of us think we have to do some good thing in the world in some short transient amount of time. So there's something odd about that. So the book was written to start a kind of discourse, a civic discourse, and I've been doing some talking, and I'm doing some more talking internationally about the book to warn people that robotic technology is accelerating in its ability to become mature. It's maturing much faster than our ethical ability to understand the consequences of the technology. And we have to have very deep conversations about privacy, identity, individuality, and the way we express ourselves through robots, if we can even influence the possible futures that we're going down. So that's the book. The reason for the talk is sort of the same thing, except applied to the Kids in Creativity Network. Many of the people I'm seeing, I'm honored by their presence because they're people who are movers and shakers in the world of kids in creativity here in Pittsburgh. You're the people who are going to make the Kids in Creativity's future come true. And it's perfect to have you in the room because I want to try and describe aspects of technology that I think are directly relevant to what Kids in Creativity needs to become. I'm going to start saying creativity correctly eventually today. But what it's going to become so that it can actually embrace aspects of technology or influence aspects of technology that make Pittsburgh a shining model of how technology can be of value in invigorating local community rather than balkanizing, separating, or creating more injustice in terms of knowledge injustice and economic injustice. So that's the reason to give the talk. So I've been thinking about how to do this. The book does this by telling stories 20 years further out, 20 years at a time. So I describe a possible future 2020, and then 2040, 2050, and then 2080, and I keep going out. And in each case, I tell a fictional story that tries to set for you the stage for what life will be like. And then that fictional story is followed by nonfiction analysis that says, here's all the technology we're working on today that you'll be surprised to learn about. And here's how that technology will change culture, unless we do something about it. So I'm kind of going to do the same thing, except it's all for 2020. So I have 4 themes I've thought up to talk about. And then I want to talk, after those 4 themes, a little bit about kids in creativity itself, the good that's happening, and I think the sort of most important things we can do to make it even better. So that's the talk. Please ask questions in the middle, so interrupt me at will. My only constraint is that I have to fly out of here at 1:30 to go to a meeting at 2. And you're welcome to stay until 1:30 or to leave earlier, and we won't take it as rude. You can even get up in a huff and walk out, and I'll just assume you're not being rude. You're being dramatic, not rude. So that's fine. So the first thing I want to talk about is data. And I called this theme open data. There's something that's happening right now, and it's happening in the world of health, in the world of environmental sensing, and even in the world of socioeconomics. The amount of data that we're collecting digitally and electronically about people, about everything from voting districts and who votes for which candidate in what area, to the median income of people and where they live. You know, the outstanding work done by people like Bob Gradek out of PNCIS at University of Pittsburgh. All the way over to extremely fine-grained data about air quality, about the exact air quality, not just in Pittsburgh, but quite soon now in East Liberty versus Shadyside, in Clairton versus Monroeville. The data that we're going to have on environmental conditions over time with extreme accuracy, on asthma cases in the local hospitals over time, and the zip codes from where those asthma cases come from, and on everything from voting behavior to personal preferences to shopping behavior. That data is going open. And it's going open rapidly because companies don't know what to do with it. It's too much data for them to manage and handle. And by opening it, they allow people to aggregate it together and cross it. So now you can do odd things, like look at asthma cases and air pollution and hospital visits and medium incomes. And that allows you to discover patterns in the data that we could never discover before because it was too much physical work, too much going to a records office in Allegheny County to unearth the data and then do a comparison. And you wouldn't know which data to go after, right, unless you actually had the question in mind already. But that day is passing. And by 2020, what we're going to have is massively open data. So what does this mean? This means that today, when I talk about technology fluency, I often talk about the idea of people understanding how technology can help them for social good. We're going to face a different problem in 2020. We're going to be drowning in data. Drowning in the sense that we won't know how to make sense of it. And the children of 2020, in fact, the children of today who will become the decision makers of 2020, that succeed are going to be the ones who can advocate for their case by having what I call data fluency. They're going to know how to visualize the data, how to think about data, how to apply statistics to that data, and then how to create rhetorically compelling argument with that data to tell a story of injustice or ineffectiveness or effectiveness, and then enable that to spread. So there's a general challenge that we face. And by the way, when I say data and 2020, we're talking about billions of records. We're talking about things you cannot load into Excel. So teaching a child how to use Excel is utterly useless in causing them to be able to understand data this way. All right, just to be clear about that. Just last week, we released from the Create Lab something that Time Magazine's got in their current issue. It's 30 years of Landsat data at full resolution that shows changes across the Earth over the last 30 years. It allows you to zoom in and see anywhere on Earth and look at the changes over the last 30 years, which means you see massive urbanization, deforestation, and ecological damage around the world. But that data is 1.5 trillion pixels per frame. It's the biggest video in history. And looking at that is hard enough. Asking the right questions and understanding how to explore that data intimately and draw conclusions and then use that data to support your conclusions and advocate for change, that's a whole different ball of wax and something that many people are not able to do. And our current educational system does not support that kind of massive data literacy. So that's the first theme, the concept of data literacy. And I call it data fluency, by the way, because if you think of literacy as meaning the idea that you can use something, you're able to use an application and be a user, a consumer, if you will. Fluency is about invention. Fluency is when you're able to take the knowledge that you have and convert it into your own argument, something that your heart is beating toward. So data fluency is saying that you don't simply understand data. You know how to take data and build from data argument and use that argument to convince other people of your position and therefore gain the power to influence decision and change in the world. So data fluency, that's number one. And these aren't in order, but the one thing about data fluency I'll also say is there's another kind of way of looking at this, which is data-driven justice. We're headed toward a world in which the ability of companies to hire the expert, like cigarette companies did in the 70s, and tell you, you know what, we did a study, smoking isn't actually dangerous, don't worry. They could do that because the data was hard to access. So they could pay a consultant. The consultant had access to the data, and what that did is privileged the knowledge the company has over the knowledge of citizenry. And so you ended up being a receiver of an interpretation made by their consultant, who was actually an MD working at an important university, getting lots of research funding from big tobacco, right? That day is passing. You're going to have access to the same data that any consultant at any company has, and it will be the data fluent amongst us who can then drive toward data justice, using the data to try and take an unjust argument and unearth it, demonstrate the injustice in that argument and try and make change. So I'm going to pause between each of these, just if people have comments or questions about this issue of data. Yeah?
I have a question about, like, you say that children might be more literate or more fluent in data analysis in the future. Right now, how do you see educators and their fluency, and how do you see that changing as we get near 2020 or whatever arbitrary date?
Right now, it's very poor on the data fluency side, children and educators alike. Just very concretely, specific programs that we see that are very valuable this way. If you look at GASP, if you look at the Southwestern Environmental Health Project, Rainer Rippel and Dave Brown and company, and if you look at Alan Robinson's CMU Air Quality Outreach Van, those are 3 organizations just in the case of air. And you can do the same thing for asthma, you can do the same thing for water quality. But just take air for a second. They directly engage with communities. Now today they engage by, for instance, GASP, lending out a sensor with which you can measure particulate matter, or teaching people to read smoke so that you can become a certified smoke reader and report bad emissions from a plant. But when you talk about data fluency, what gets exciting is when they can do a program where they go to Frick Park and you give 300 children all an air quality meter that's cheap. And we're developing them and others are developing them. So this will happen. when they can wander the park and then come back, you just got 6 million points of air data over time and space. When you can visualize the 6 million points and start to draw correlations, that means the teacher's understanding the new visualization software that's coming online now, it barely even exists. Things like Gigapan that the teachers don't know how to use yet. They'll have to know how to use it well enough to teach its students. But these advocacy groups actually help immensely because they become an interface between the technology innovators and the educational side. I think that the bleeding edge usually comes from the out-of-school programming. That's where you can take risks. You don't have to tie this to core standards, and I'll be talking about Common Core near the end because there's some big issues there too. But it's the bleeding edge happens on the informal side. But for justice, you have to end up transforming it into formal education because that's where you touch the largest number of at-risk children. So you simply can't do this in informal education and succeed that way. So that's a partial answer. Let me leave it at that. Any other comments about big data and such like, you know?
Kids are growing up in information is super accessible and they're growing up with media being malleable throughout their lives. But with so much information, how do you help to keep from information overload or information apathy?
That's precisely the difficult question. And the challenge becomes how in the research process at school you teach children that information can be valid, that you have to do critical thinking about data sources just like you do when you read an article or a history book. And then how do you give them the tools to extract information from the World Wide Web that's massive, visualize it, and then tell a story with it, tell a narrative story with it. It's kind of like thinking about video production. You can go and do hours of B-roll and interviews, and then you have to be able to understand how to step back and understand where the gems are in that and how to produce from that a cogent story that you can actually tell to somebody that demonstrates that. It's storytelling. This is a different case of storytelling because you're going to have different tools. You're going to have to be able to write scripts that operate online and filters. You're going to have to use massive data visualization systems like layering on Google Maps and time-based layering that doesn't exist today, but by 2020 will absolutely exist, where you don't simply look at socioeconomic status as a snapshot like we do today, but you can look at it as a fluent over time, and you can go back and forth and look at a particular community and how it's changed in 10 years. And then you can go back and look over those same 10 years how budgeting for education has changed in that community. And then you can start to connect dots between education, budgeting, and changes in fluency. So there will be multiple tools by 2020 that do that, because everything you have online today, all the tables you see, all the graphs you see that don't have time, will have time by 2020. So now you're dealing with temporality. You're dealing with the question of change over time, and that's going to be new. So let me move to theme 2. There will have plenty of time for questions as we go back and forth, I hope. So this one's kind of related. It's not a huge slam dunk, wow. The next one gets a little more complicated and gee whiz. There's been a change. If you look at the congressional funding of things like public broadcasting system, they've gone down massively. My wife used to work at WGBH Nova. And when you talk to people at WGBH Nova, they say this place is cratered. The people are gone. They're independent consultants at best. National programming, producing documentary or even footage, programming that is meant for social and civic discourse at the national level, craters. And the reason is because federal funding for that program is the first to go. As that's happened simultaneously with that, we've seen a kind of relevance of local production companies, a relevance to local production. And you've seen things like OnQ right here in Pittsburgh, where WQED has tried to reinvent itself by thinking about local production and how local production allows it to have a kind of value proposition to the local world right here. I think we're going to see another shift by 2020 that's really interesting. And it has to do with, yes, Google Glass and mobile devices and mobile sensing. It has to do with the idea that community as we define it has balkanized. The initial onset of mobile devices, of things like Facebook and Twitter, have actually balkanized a sense of geographic locale. Some things like Groupon have kind of reinvigorated the sense of locality. But by and large, what social media has done is spread us out. Kind of like you're plastering and then you spread the plaster out, because you become connected not to the people that live within 2 miles of you who have similar issues. Rather, you become connected to 5 million people who care about the same things you care about but are completely on different parts of the planet. What that does is good and bad, right? It creates a community that has principles and practices you believe in. So it can give you a sense of belonging. But you lose from that a sense of locality. And that sense of locality is very important when you look at specific kinds of issues: health, water quality, air quality, education, civic decisions, right? The civic decisions the city council makes are here, right? You can't spread those across the planet. And so the advocacy you need often has to be local if you're going to have locally felt improvement. So what we've seen is the funding for the national programming is dying. Local programming is being born, and yet we're quashing a sense of locality because of social media. That, I believe, will change, because location awareness in civic media and social media, if you think about glass, if you think about the fact that the GPS encodings that we have on our cell phones that tell us where we are being used by ever greater numbers of the applications that we load on these cell phones and use. I'm gesturing in my pocket, but I'm kind of the cell phone dummy. Doesn't even have a camera on it, so not much of a cell phone there. It's just a walkie-talkie, basically. But the devices that we have that have GPS encodings and can actually use that to relate actionably to what we're doing, that's going up. And so I think there's a trend we're headed to that I think will become mature by 2020, which is what I call hyperlocal production. So the idea of locality in Pittsburgh may be melted away. In fact, the idea of locality by a production company at the Pittsburgh level may be melted away. What I think we're going to see is production at the level of small groups, where the small group has a core interest in a very local place, like the southern end of Frick Park in Braddock. What's interesting about that is what they're producing is not a movie. It's not something you're going to go and see in a movie theater. They're going to produce applications and information, interactivity that you're going to see on your phone, on your smart device, on your mobile system. But that idea of tending away from national to local, but now losing local and going hyperlocal, I think is very real. Now that goes right back to sensors, because every cell phone you have will be a sensor. Every other device you wear will be a sensor. And that means that the information you're collecting will be relevant to right here and now. But what it means is that I believe you'll see communities forming around the idea of producing material for others to see. I've heard wonderful stories about biodiversity, where you take the idea of people walking through Frick Park, and the moment they step into Frick Park, they and their cell phones become part of a biodiversity army who's trying to figure out where the invasive kudzu is, or where the invasive garlic plants are, and marshal their efforts to try and identify it, organize where it is, and then deal with it. So on an issue-specific way, I think you're going to see this kind of hyperlocality. That's going to change things like the Children and Creativity Network a little bit, because what it means, I believe, is to be leading edge on that. It means to understand what are the hyperlocal issues that we face in our communities. I remember work we did many years ago in Lawrenceville and in Braddock, where we discovered the exact same issue, traffic calming. So communities that are throughways, byways for people to travel through, who don't care about the community itself. Well, because of the way media is being evolved today, and because of the locality we have on our phones and mobile devices, and cars, by the way, we had a dream back then that when people are traveling through that area, they're specifically targeted with programming that helps them understand that area, so they don't just go on the bridge, on Rankin Bridge. They learn about Braddock, and they consider Braddock as a destination, as a place to engage with at a community level. Well, when you have these mobile devices we have now compared to 6 years ago when we were brainstorming this, it's far easier to imagine that kind of programming. Literally Rankin Bridge programming. You drive on the bridge, you get programming from Rankin Bridge. So that means groups come together with common interests and produce information that in turn is broadcast in this incredibly localized way, basically trying to convert people from a passive human being to somebody who's active and engaged in a local issue. So that, I think, is this idea of hyperlocal programming. Comments or questions about that idea? Yes.
So do you see this as being like an option kind of thing? Like, do I have to have a certain app so that that's going to happen? Or because I could see it being sort of an overload too, like
Yeah,
trying
absolutely.
to filter out information, or or like just have some peace and quiet.
Peace and quiet would be lovely. It's an interesting question. You know, there's weird slippery slopes in the space of how people bombard themselves with information today, right? People will, for ridiculously small amounts of incremental savings, allow their email to go out where they get bombarded with junk mail. So first of all, it's odd. People's value proposition is a little bit twisted. They'll say, oh, you're going to give me a $2 discount with the Advantage card? Fine, I'll give you my email, and now you can send me a whole bucket load of emails from now on that I have to delete. The question you can ask is, if people have such tiny thresholds for accepting more information, what's truly valuable, and what will drive people to see real value in something? I believe it's community experiences, sense of true community. I don't know how we get there. I don't know if it's about advertising or about value propositions where companies partner with this stuff. I hate to see companies become the thin edge of the wedge on this stuff, because then there's always a corporate attitude behind it that says, well, this is great, we'll do some community information campaigning, but we'll have this great sponsored by thus and such company ad, which gets bigger every year, right? At first it's 3 seconds long, then it's 5 seconds long. At first it's not on your screen, it's a link, then it's half the screen, and now you go on video sites and it's full half of your screen, or it's the whole screen for 20 seconds, so you have to start the video, walk away, and come back 20 seconds later, and then you can watch what you intended to watch, right? So there is this thin edge of the wedge problem with who markets it. But fundamentally, it's about the value that it has inherent to it. People have limited bandwidth. You want them to end up selecting for the information sources that are truly valuable, which means you want to best the existing information sources. You want to be something that's better than they do. And that's a design challenge I don't have an answer to. It's a good question. This one's very ill worked out. I really don't know where we'll be in 2020. I'm convinced that we'll have hyperlocal programming, but I don't know how. Yes?
So one of the things that keeps resonating back to me is this, like, the idea of place-based, so bringing it back to place. And so if we think about that from an educational perspective, how can we how can we design our educational model to reflect place-based? One of the struggles that we have as educators is that there's a loss of sense of place for children in 2013.
Right.
And so whether it be your home or the street right outside of your home or your larger city. So I guess my question, I'm curious about your thinking around how in this short amount of time between 2013 and 2020, how can we provide that connection back to a community that from an educational standpoint can create the hyperlocal?
Part of it that I think is exciting, one of the rare cases where technology I think can be truly useful, is it can take the sense of place that we have, it can layer upon it a desire to explore that space, to annotate that space with information that makes that space personalized. I'll give you some examples specifically. Your school is your school, but I use air quality because it's so easy to use. If you do a walkabout of your school and you start to graph air quality, you start to look at air quality, you walk around your school in a different way. You look in nooks and crannies, you measure this number. The very fact that you're measuring this number, it gives you a new sense of awareness of place because you associate those numbers with that place. By the same token, if you study mycology and you're going to go find some mushrooms, when you go into Frick Park and you walk around looking for mushrooms, you do something you never do in Frick Park. You look down for an hour, and you see black walnuts, and you look up and you go, oh, that's a black walnut tree, wow. And you see garlic mustard, and you go, wow, there's that much garlic mustard? Oh my gosh, we're in big trouble here. So you cast your eyes downward precisely because you're attending to something that you never would have cared about before. So what you need to do, I believe, in education, and what you need to do with technology, is allow technology to enrich the sense of place by taking things that are invisible to us and making them visible. Now, invisible things aren't really invisible, right? The air we breathe affects us, but we can't see it. When that technological device gives you a number, though, it burns into your brain the fact that every time I go to that tire swing, I have VOCs off the chart. Why do we make swings out of tire when they're bad for people with asthma? What are we doing? Or if you look for the mushrooms, it makes something to you, the ground, which is ordinarily invisible to you, completely visible. It makes you care about the ground in a way that you didn't before. The other example that's great is the benthic macroinvertebrate thing in streams. Ogle Bay Foundation does a fantastic job of this in West Virginia. Wheeling Jesuit University does this, and our own Pittsburgh Parks Conservancy does this. But you go into a stream, and they kick some stones, and take a net, and collect critters that show up from under the stones in the stream. And they look at them under a microscope. And they squat right there in the stream and look at them with the magnifying glass. And what happens is this stream that you've walked by 100 times becomes enriched with a narrative. Because when you see those animals and you go, oh, I can see mayflies, that's an indicator of a healthy ecology. Or I don't see any mayflies. That means this is an unhealthy ecosystem here right now. It changes the view they have of the watershed, of the animals, of the cycle of life between pollution that humans emit and the animals and how the animals respond. But it also changes the stream to them. It makes the stream visible in a way that has always been invisible to them. All they cared about before was maybe splashing or jumping over it and not getting wet. So in a way, this becomes naturally hyperlocal, because if you turn yourself toward the very smallest minutiae that are the indicators of the life we live on Earth, then you are talking about the places we walk and stoop and look. And the sensors you're using are in your hand, the things you're physically measuring devices, using as measuring devices in our local space. And that to me is very exciting because it reorients us toward awareness. In the quantified self movement, there's this sense of self-awareness that instead of going to a doctor and saying, didn't work, I'm still coughing, and the doctor just giving you another medicine and saying, okay, well, instead of the red pill, try the green pill. Come back in 2 months. And your job in that situation is you take the green pill. And then 2 months later, you go back to the doctor and say, I'm a little bit better, but not much. And he says, oh, then you should try the purple pill. And it takes very little time for the doctor that way. And maybe your problem gets solved and maybe it doesn't. That process, though, makes you basically a robot. You're an automaton responding to whatever the doctor is saying. When you turn that on its head and have somebody keep a diary, and they keep a diary where they keep diary, whether it's electronic or not, of how much they're coughing when, and what they did the day before they're coughing, and what the particulate matter measurements were the hour before they coughed, and how long they coughed for, they become aware of themselves. And that self-awareness makes them far deeper thinkers about the causality in their life, about the actions they take, the behavior they have, and the resulting coughing fits that they have. So again, simple example, but minutiae makes us more human. And if we share that minutiae with others, when it's about something like our local park, it makes us more community-centric. And they're communities that are local. They're not anymore this balkanized sense of community, where it's me and everybody else who has a fetish for wearing purple socks, and we're going to have the purple sock community. That's a community, but it's a community that has no sense of geographic locale, and it can't affect change locally. So let me go to the third. Oh, go ahead, Clara.
I just want to mention one example actually that happened while we at Assemble was actually going around and then documenting locations around Garfield, and we printed these image of the gardens which is in Garfield, and I had people coming here from this neighborhood that didn't know this place, and they're like, oh my gosh, I have to go to this garden because I would love to have a spot there, and it just like I was outsider coming into this neighborhood and documenting the place and actually opened the eyes of people that are locally here. So
it's a great example. There's a common repeating trope. You go to any community in the US that has a community garden, and you take that community garden to people who live 3 minutes walking distance away who don't know about it, and they're blown away. It's incredible the degree to which people have a lack of awareness of the local facility, probably because we spend so much time on other issues. And it's a beautiful example. Well, let me go to the third one. This is bad news. So I'll start with a story and then give you the general bad news. In my book, it's a chapter called New Mediocrity. And mediocrity is a funny word because I wanted to combine the concept of the media driving us away from democracy into a new form of decision-making, mediocrity, which is a very mediocre form of decision-making. It's bad. It's not good. But let me start with an example. My wife and I were trying to buy, I think, tickets online. And you've all gone online. You're going to enter your credit card information. But before you can, there are some curly letters and numbers that show up and you have to type them in, right? That's called CAPTCHA or reCAPTCHA. Why does that show up? Well, it shows up for a few reasons. The one you know right away is they say, because we want you to prove you're not a robot, please enter this word. Great, that's what you're doing. But that's not all you're doing. When you see those letters and they're kind of squiggly and then you enter them in, you're actually providing some service to somebody. Because what's going on is the New York Times is sitting here trying to scan the last 100 years of printed matter that they have, which is massive documentation, right? But some of the newspapers they have in their archives were printed poorly. So the automatic scanners that are trying to make this become electronic and digital so they can search it can't do all the words. And there's words they miss. Well, guess what? Those words end up on your computer screen. And so that squiggly word you see is a word that a company that's being paid by the New York Times to digitize wasn't able to digitize. So that company buys time from another company who is licensed with Google to show that word to you, and then you look at that word, you type it in. And when you do that, you're doing an increment of work for them. And they have hundreds of people get that same word. And they make sure that when Steve types it in, he types in the same word as Kathy. And if enough people agree, they say, oh, that's the correct one, thank you, and they send it back to the company and they can digitize that word now. So now this is kind of interesting, right? You think that you're acting to buy a ticket to the opera But whilst you're buying a ticket to the opera, you're helping a company do digitization. Now, let's stop and think about who's getting paid for what here. Are you getting paid for that? No, if I recall correctly, you're spending money to buy a ticket to the opera. Is the reCAPTCHA company getting paid? Yeah, they get paid a bundle of money for every word they digitize correctly. Is the New York Times getting paid? Well, yeah, they're paying reCAPTCHA because they're going to make money on this, because they're going to give you search facilities and sell it to companies. So any company can search all the New York Times archives digitally. So everybody's getting paid except you, and you're doing a service. Now this is where the story gets kind of interesting. We're online buying tickets to something a couple of weeks ago, and instead of showing what looks like printed matter in a newspaper, it showed what was clearly a cropped up picture of a photograph. So it was a cropped piece of a photograph. And what I could see is I could see the awning of a house in the roof line, and the number, the house number. And it said, what number is this? So now, it's the same company. What are they doing to me now? Now they want to figure out where everybody lives. So they want to know for sure the house numbers of all the houses on the street, even houses which, God forbid, the computer can't process the house number of, because maybe the letter's crooked or got painted with the wrong color black. So they're using you to figure out the house number of a house on a street somewhere. It's not a made-up problem. It's a real house on a real street that's been photographed by a real robot somewhere. And now it's being shown to you to do. And so, I mean, I'm looking at this. My wife's looking at this. We go, we don't want to do this, right? This is the level of service we don't actually want to provide. We don't wish to, because it seems like you're invading somebody's privacy in some way. It seems like we don't necessarily have the permission of that homeowner to be doing this. It's somebody's house. What if they showed you a picture of a human being and said, help us estimate how old this person is? 30 to 40, 40 to 50, or 50 to 60? They could do that because you know what? We were stuck. We tried to regenerate new examples, and every example it gave us was a photograph of a house. Different example in each case. It never gave me a squiggly character from a New York Times article. So what that is an example of is the mediocrity that we're headed into. That mediocrity is interesting because it's collecting data from us when we don't understand that we're providing value to a corporation, to a corporate entity. Where this is headed is very odd. If you look at the Advantage card, it's a really great example. There was a study done 3 weeks ago where they gave people a $10 discount at the supermarket and said, will you go and take this discount card? By the way, we'll record everything you buy. 97% of people take the discount card for $10. So for $10, it's worth giving up information about everything I buy. Okay. Then they told the same people, wait a second. If you give me back the $10 card before you go in there, I'll give you an $8 card, but you don't have to tell me anything you buy. You preserve all your privacy. Well, guess what? Nobody swaps it for the $8 card. So it's not even worth $2 of incremental freedom to have the option of privacy. Even if we don't know if we care about privacy or not, it's not worth $2 to think about it, to consider fulfilling the possibility that we have privacy in case we decide it's important. What that tells you about us as consumers is that we're willing to etch away our privacy in one direction, one downhill direction. We will have ever less privacy in this world that we're living, and that companies will, with very tiny value propositions, be able to etch away at it and get us to say yes to ever more willingness to get rid of that privacy. Now, the idea behind new mediocrity and where this gets really interesting is, for instance, several technology companies have billboards on the street that are electronic. You know, they can show varying graphics, like a giant LCD screen. But they have a little camera in them. And actually by 2015 or 2016, that little camera will be able to see you walking by and notice whether you look at the advertisement or not. Not only can it notice whether you look at the advertisement or not, it can tell whether you smile or frown, or whether you get kind of stopped and stare at it for a while or not. That same camera technology can tell when you go into a store and you turn over a price tag that you in fact turned over the price tag. Did you care enough about that piece of clothing to look at the price tag? It can also tell when you look at the price tag whether you giggle or smile or talk to your friend about it, or whether it scares you. So every behavior that you show in the physical world becomes trackable. Just the same way that today everything you do with your mouse online is trackable. And what that means is that you, just the same way that by looking at that house number and digitizing that value, when you pass by an advertisement without even deciding to volunteer for it, you're actually in a study. And you're now a volunteer in the study of, let's see what demographic of people respond to which advertisement, how. And when a company collects millions of examples of that, which they already do online, by the way, they can optimize the advertising messaging just for you. And when I say you, I mean they can figure out what works for a demographic that each one of you fits in. And they can make those demographics ever narrower every year. And what that means is that eventually they can have the best possible ad that has the best possible chance of success with me, and it can be completely different than the best possible ad for you. Now, where does that put us? Because today, 20 years ago, you pay an advertising executive, and that company comes along and they use intuition and aesthetics to design advertising. And political campaigns do focus groups and do try and figure out for every core demographic in their focus group what's the best message for them. And they vary it, right? The message they leave for me on my phone might be different from the message they leave for one of you on your phone, to try and get us to vote for the one person they want us to vote for. But when you get millions of examples, more than any advertising company can deal with, then you use machine learning, you use computers to do something humans can't do, which is to absolutely optimize the messaging, to try every color combination out, to try every word possibility out, every combination of words, every possible feature, every possible value proposition out, until you nail the magic buttons for every one of us. And that's something humans can't do without computers, without big data, and without these observational systems that media is deploying that can see everything we do. And once you've done that, once you've taken that step where the advertising is sort of perfect, when you've reached perfection, perfection means we basically do what the company wants us to do. And that's odd, because then we become the robots. We become remote control. So the challenge is, as companies use computational tools like that, invade our privacy ever more deeply, and take on themselves the ability to massively customize messaging to every one of us individually, so the companies end up with the ability to push our buttons just the way they want. And we all have buttons. Somewhere we have a button we can get pushed. And when they know where those buttons are and they push them, then I believe we lose our sense of autonomy and freedom. So from a democratic point of view, the problem with that is it's actually the opposite of democracy. It's the opposite of giving everybody justifiably equivalent information and allowing us to have discourse and make decisions. Because instead, it's giving each one of us highly customized information that forces each of us into a consequence of action that we believe is the right one. And we might be happy. We might each be happy because they convince us to be happy. But in fact, does society make the right decision then? Well, only for corporate America, only for government. The cover of the book is a fun example of that. There's 41 colors of blue on the cover. And there's a story inside that makes it clear why I did that. That's just oil paint. And there's a fun, actually, story on the back that explains how we made the cover of the book. We went to France and got original pigments from the place that artists used to get these pigments. So Google wanted to choose a new color for the front of their website. And how would you used to do this? You would ordinarily hire a graphic designer and you tell them, we want a new color blue on our website. And then they go and think, and they do a treatment for you. They come back with a treatment and say, here's how it'll look on your envelope, and here's how it'll look on your website, on your mobile device. What do you think? So the graphic designer at Google did that. They came up with their 3 or 4 options, came back to the founders and said, here's what you can do. And the folks in charge said, well, how'd you come up with these particular colors? And he said, well, I'm a graphic designer. These are the colors I chose after careful study. And they said, okay, forget it, goodbye. So instead, they chose 41 evenly spaced hues of blue in the spectrum. And every time you went to the website, they literally rolled a dice and showed you the website clothed in one of those 41 colors of blue. And did this for a few 100 million people. And collected the data on the behavior of those 100 million people. And they chose behavioral data that I don't know about. Could be time on task, could be how long you spent on the website, could be how much you buy, could be anything really, right? And they simply went with the color blue that had the right behavioral outcome on the most people. And that's just choosing one color blue for everybody, right? What if you did it by zip code? What if you did it by last name? What if you did it by gender? What if every one of us got the right color blue for us? Right defined, of course, not by us, but by a company. So that was a mouthful. But what's going on that's interesting is that this mediocrity thing is coming. And what I believe is powerful about children and creativity and about 2020 is that by 2020, this will have arrived. And the powerful people will be the people that break out of it, the people who can get above it, they can lift themselves out of it. And that means being aware of it, understanding the degree to which we're going to be personally tracked, understanding how we can turn on and off privacy filters in our lives. And so making us privacy literate and making our children today understand standards of privacy and the degree to which we can control who we are, not just online anymore, but physically in the world as we walk around. How we can turn off location tracking on our cell phone so that we aren't tracked as we walk around in the physical world. That is going to be incredibly important to the ability of people to fight against this by 2020. So that's my third complicated example I have for you. Yes, Kathy?
I was curious how you feel about it when that data is open.
Better. Open data, I think, is fantastic because people can interpret it at will, except when data is thick enough, when there's enough of it, it simply drowns people. So unless we also have tools that allow us to swim and discover, it's simply drowning us. That's one danger.
So, but in the instance where it is thick and you can use it for discovery, do you see it actually enabling creativity?
It can, absolutely.
And sort of having maybe a bit of an inverse effect to how you're describing it?
And maybe that's what we need is the invention of sort of, there will be a non-corporate push that uses the same data in a really exciting way, right? That takes the exact same thing about behavioral tracking and brings us together in some interesting way using that tracking. That I think is very exciting. There's sites, right, that you can go to on the web. I don't know which one this does. This might do either one. Where you do a news search and you have a slider bar from liberal to conservative. And as you slide it, you get various results. If you use that by going to your setting, like you're liberal, say put it on liberal and you read all the liberal stories, then you're simply balkanizing, right? You have open data, but you're actually affecting a filter that causes you only to become narrower in your minds. If you're liberal and you actually use that slider to explicitly go and browse conservative and not just liberal, then that's kind of interesting because it gives you a sense of what everybody in aggregate is seeing. But that means, again, it's kind of like the first one. It's this data fluency. It's sort of the fluency of understanding how privacy is changing and how this data, behavior tracking data has come about. If we're fluent in it and we use it the right way, it's absolutely powerful. You could imagine incubators where we take this kind of behavioral data and actually challenge people to do social good with it locally. And that could be a really interesting direction to go, where you actually foresee this effect and create a wave front that takes it in the right direction. That'd be exciting. My fourth one is pure science. Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I feel this kind of internal struggle between, on one hand, at the beginning, feeling like we're moving towards a more empathic civilization, the ability to connect and see from others by hearing their stories in any kind of ways, digitally, through data and all those other things. And on the other hand, being very separate and removed and being just driven by kind of individual interests, even if it's kind of corporately. And so, how do we reconcile through awareness, through any of these things that we do have the ability to move past things like things that divide us, nationality, ethnicity, geography.
So part of what I struggle with even talking about the hyperlocal thing is that the spreading out across the world is actually a really good thing too. There's a speech that Bill Gates gave at a conference I was at, and he said this really beautiful, poignant thing where he said, if we could randomize our neighborhood street, if you could take the neighborhood you live on and randomly sample people from around the world and put them all on that street. He said, if you did this, and then he said a bunch of statistics that, if you have 25 people on your street, 16 of them would have malaria, 4 of them would have this problem, 7 of them would have witnessed infant mortality for their children. He just rattled them off. The amount of empathy you would get by that randomization is fantastical because you would realize the diversity of experiences we have across the world. And in a way, right, the internet enables us to do that. But no, it doesn't on the other side, right? We aren't randomized on the same street. Yeah, I can read about what's happening in Syria, but you also become inured to the reality of that. Those messages, the severity of the messages in the news, I think you get inured to that and you stop having it as an emotional reaction that causes you to take action. So maybe we have to start locally and then spread out. I don't know how we deal with that. one thing that I think is really powerful that we've seen in things like the Hear Me project is you do very local production. You tell stories that are of great value locally, but then you share them with people that may be nearby but demographically very distinct. Somebody from the suburbs, somebody from the 4-H club that's completely rural. And so you start to break out of those boundaries, and then eventually somebody from Turkey, right? So you can break out of those boundaries, but maybe you do it once you have studied your own locality so deeply that when you see an alternative world, an alternative place, you have taken the invisible and made it visible. So you see that alternative place with a visibility, with a spectacle that you couldn't have had before you produced a local thing locally. So maybe what we need is a international program where we do hyper-local things in Pittsburgh and then join them with hyper-local things in other countries.
I was actually hoping that that's what you were going to say. And part of the work that we're doing through Kids and Creativity with the Hype Learning Network is a deeply local network starting in New York, Chicago, and Pittsburgh, and then growing globally. So really thinking, what is that potential when you connect practitioners from other local communities of shared interests? So it's this deeply local commitment, and the connections really become interest-based.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Right on. I'm actually going to skip to my 5th thing because I'm going to run out of time and I don't want to do that. I want to have discussion time. So we'll just have to have a discussion, informal discussion later for the number 4. Sorry. So what I wanted to talk about a little bit is about the Kids in Creativity Network and some local trends that are going on and where this is taking us. So first of all, there's a fundamental challenge that the academic environment faces at my level, the university academic environment, which is MOOCs, massively online open courses. And it's really interesting because there's this existentialist threat people consider where they say, oh my goodness, these are cheaper. There's universities like the University of, where was the philosophy department? Do you remember, Marty? San Jose State University, that's right. San Jose State University bought MOOC curricula, which means videotapes of famous people, giving speeches for philosophy. And then told the philosophy department, you're going to have to integrate, actually no, they bought it for the whole university. They told every faculty member, you're going to have to integrate this into your classes. So you're TAs essentially now. You're going to show videos of famous teachers teaching, and then you're going to stand aside and answer questions and help run discussion. And the entire philosophy department unanimously at San Jose State wrote a letter saying, no way. We believe in the personal connections that you forge between students and teachers, and you miss all of this when you do this MOOC thing. And you devalue us as educators when you suggest that this famous Harvard philosopher, true story, is so good that every student in every university should actually be getting his lessons on philosophy rather than ours. You lose ecological diversity, right? We become a monoculture, all fed the same tune by the same person. So universities are already in this weird existentialist crisis mode where they're wondering what their future is. My claim about Kids in Creativity and about something we've been doing at the Create Lab called the Satellite Network is that we actually need to rethink the entire spectrum of collaborative relationships between institutions dedicated to learning. So let me explain because it's a mouthful. So today universities do this degree program. If they do some outreach, mostly they parachute in and then drop out. So they parachute in, do a test at some school district for a semester, and then leave. And the school district doesn't have lasting value from that. And by the way, if they leave a piece of technology there, when they leave, they're gone. The piece of technology degrades. Nobody can fix it, so it's done. Maybe it works for a year, and then it's done. At the same time, though, if you look at the ecology of organizations dedicated to helping educationally, I'll go by age maybe, right? You go to early childhood, you've got organizations like PACE, Pittsburgh Association for the Education of Young Children, developing very important professional development programs that do training of in-service and pre-service teachers. But then you have the actual pre-service programs, like what Carlo has and what Pitt has, where education departments are actually doing the educating of the pre-service teacher who gets interning into the school, right? And today they just go in and they're just an intern. Then you have the in-service programs. Then you have universities like ours where we invent technology but don't necessarily connect it in a lasting way to the community. Then you have groups like Asset, where Asset comes in, warehouses actual physical technologies for the schools to use, provides training into a new school, takes the stuff back, cleans it, fixes it, orders replacement parts, and has it ready to go for next year. So wow, they're sustainable, but they're sustainable with last year's technology. There's no vector from the university to them, and there's certainly no vector from the university to the professional development program to the pre-service program, where you teach tomorrow's teachers how to use it. So when they go and intern at their local school, they can teach today's teachers how to use it. And you see the pathway is really kind of obvious in retrospect. You want innovation, sure, but you want innovation to feed directly into professional development and training, directly to pre-service. You want pre-service to go to in-service. You want all of this to connect to your standards, but then you want this to all be sustained through things like asset, so that you have a warehousing facility that warehouses the development and training and warehouses the physical artifacts you need. It's a beautiful story. We've been trying to develop that with a number of partners in West Virginia, including the June Harless Center at Marshall University and West Liberty University and West Virginia University and Carlow College. So they're all partners of ours in trying to establish this kind of framework together with PACE and Asset. But take it away from just the Create Lab. This is a general solution that I think is very powerful to sustainable innovation. And that's something that Kids in Creativity can do, because today what's exciting about Kids in Creativity is we all share ideas. We are all more aware than we ever were before of what we're each doing. But for instance, with the Create Satellite Network, we write proposals together. We have retreats where we invent the next set of innovations every year. We decide what we're going to innovate on next year based on the needs of PACE and Asset and Carlow and all the other partners. So what you do is you turn the technology innovators into somebody who's not just feeding a desire to get tenure. They're feeding a desire from the people who are going to educate tomorrow's community. So I think there's something really powerful about that. And Kids in Creativity is off to a great start because it connects people. It makes awareness exist. The next step is literally creating a chain so that innovation goes to true training and pushes forth from there. Now, there's a couple of currents of headwinds that are problems with this model. One major headwind has to do with the Common Core, believe it or not. The Common Core has some great qualities to it, but the Common Core nails down English and math. The degree to which it hits anything from English to more complex social science, history, to more complex social sciences is poor. It's in the English side of things. The degree to which it has technology, and in particular computational thinking or computer science, is nil. So as people hew towards the Common Core standards, the national standards for education, we're going to head further and further away from innovation getting injected through this kind of pre-service model into the classroom, because you can't justify it with the Common Core. So we have to do it a different way. But the different way lines up perfectly with making the invisible visible. So that's my pitch. What we need is to take technology and computational thinking and forget about them as individual unit classes in high school or middle school. Throw it away. Take technology and computational thinking and put it in disciplinary classes that are not technological, like biology, like poetry, like history, and English, and make them in service of disciplinary knowledge. So make the invisible visible for the sake of true disciplinary knowledge. And when you do that, when you have your biology class using technology, and yeah, they're creating a layer, and yeah, they're learning about big data, and yes, they're learning about particulate matter, but they're doing it all not in a technology class. They're doing it in a disciplinary class, then it does nail the Common Cores. So this is a major change we need in how we think about technology. Basically, I think we need to forget about technology as technology for technology's sake. Now, people will come to you and say, that's horrible, we need STEM education to fill the pipeline. We need future engineers, we don't have enough engineers in America. And I realize that what I'm saying doesn't help us get future engineers. What it helps us get is a massively fluent society who uses technology in every endeavor, from journalism to environmentalism. And that, I think, is more important if you think about where we need to be at by 2020. So basically, take disciplinary knowledge, inject within it this kind of fluency of technology, and create these complete pathways from innovation and ideation all the way to sustainable deployment and warehousing. That, I think, is a really exciting future that Kids in Creativity Network in Pittsburgh could be really proud of by 2020. And that's, I think, doable in 6 years. So yeah, I wanted to get to that because that's important. One other major point to make is about informal versus formal education. Museums and informal education are fantastic places for experimentation, but the problem we have, the 90% problem we have, is not with children who go to informal learning spaces. It's with people who don't. We have to nail formal. And so again, you can do all the STEM exercises you want in an after-school program at the Carnegie Science Center. But until we figure out how to inject technology right into formal education so that every single fifth grader has access to it in school, during the time when they have to be there. Unless we do that, we're actually going to simply increase the injustice gap between people who have the education and the information and people who don't. No way to close the gap without nailing down formal education across the board. So strong words, I'm sorry to say. People will disagree with me about that, but I'm pretty convinced that that's a direction at least worth talking about. Questions and comments about that one? Yes?
Do you think there's a place for a distribution platform like Khan Academy to either complement, supplement, or be a part of early stage learning curriculum?
I think it's always possible that it can be a good supplement, sure. That's what most of the people on the MOOC side say, is we don't want to minimize the teacher's role. We simply want to add material they use. But it's a closed system. You know, when you have videotapes from a famous Harvard philosopher and you play them, the time you're playing that video is time when you are not talking. What can I say? There's no easy solution to that, right? It would be fantastic to have access to that information at home, but not everybody has internet to get that material at home. There's no good solution. One of the things that we used to do is very early in our days, we did this Arts and Bots program where people used craft material to teach technology classes, basically. And we made two huge changes. One was the class was a technology class. Two, the class was in a shrink-wrapped curriculum. We give it to the teachers. But when you give them a shrink-wrapped curriculum like that, it actually disempowers them. You're telling them, go study this and use it. And they don't have time for that, and they don't have time to displace something in their classroom for that. We changed the model and completely inverted it. First of all, now we give it to poetry and English teachers. So they're not teaching technology. They're saying, here's a poem. Read this poem. Get to know this poem so well that you can make a sculpture, a robotic sculpture about the poem. The students have to know so much more about the poem to make a sculpture about it. You have to read it 50 times. You have to think about the cadence and the timing of how you say it. You have to think about the meaning of the words and the imagery created in your head if you're going to make a kinetic sculpture. So the technology becomes in service of this idea of rhetorical expression. Second thing we did is we don't give those teachers any curricular package like that. We put them in a workshop where they take their curriculum and they design a way to integrate this in the disciplinary model of their curriculum. So every single teacher that uses Arts and Bots does it in a completely customized and unique way. They own it. And then it's empowering rather than disempowering. So the trick becomes, you can't take the MOOC thing and say, here's a website with lectures on every lesson plan that you have, right? You have 10 chapters and here's one on each of the 10 chapters, use them. And if you're just saying to them, I expect the children to see all 10 of these, you're simply taking away from time in the classroom. If there's a way to present that, mix and match, where it can come in really short segments, where it can be small, where some can be figures that they use in class, some can be an animation that's really useful, an interactive that they use. And if it can be, what do you call it when you order dinner piece by piece? A la carte. If it's extremely a la carte, right? Then that's interesting maybe, because you're simply creating tools that they may use. And in an a la carte way, the way I use it will be completely different from the way my colleague will use it. But you have to think about empowerment, I think. And that means making them very short and making them very flexible so that you can think of many different ways to use them and they're all equally appropriate.
You made a powerful statement about having impact and scale within schools. The challenge I have in my mind about your statement is a lot of the innovation around uses of integrating technology in these different disciplines actually happen outside of school. And a lot of people that experience that, bring it back to the K-12 system. I mean, the uses of technology 10 years ago didn't happen in school. The innovative uses they happen either after school or universities, within families,
Right.
and developed in a space where it became so powerful. The doors of K-12 were knocked down, and there was a lot of resistance to that. So I see both being very important and interdependent. The innovation that happens in informal learning, and seeking you shall find opportunity within K-12. Without one, you're not going to have the other.
So in a way, I think that's exactly right, that informal learning serves as an incubator. It's sort of the high-risk startup incubator in a way. But there's a reason that happened, I think, socially. If you look at the universities and the innovators that I was part of even and knew, we knew how to talk to folks at the Carnegie Science Center for an after-school program, right? When we would go and try and talk to the school, we would go straight to the school district. And we couldn't talk to the superintendent, they were too busy, and we had no way of getting access into the classroom. So very quickly it became apparent to us that we can't deal with these guys. We got to go back to the informal learning space. What's changed is organizational communication. We go talk to Carlow College, and they create a new class, literally for Children's Innovation Project. That's an example. They've created a class on Children's Innovation Project at Carlow for pre-service teachers. So the pathway is one we weren't even aware of, right? The technology innovator often is not aware of the departments of education and how they function, to even understand organizationally how to access the school the right way. So I think we can become more high risk in school than we ever have before if we understand those organizational relationships. But you're absolutely right that we can always take bigger risks in the informal learning space than we ever will be able to in the formal space.
The whole point is there's parallel paths.
Yeah.
So it's great. My last comment about the resistance levels of different institutions. Early on in the 90s, K-12 was very resistant to use of technology. Higher education was even more resistant.
Yeah.
So the fact that you're working with these schools of education, these different universities, is quite an accomplishment.
I think it shows that they're also in this position where they're willing to take risks because they also are in this kind of existentialist crisis mode, right? If we're going to have all online learning, how many teachers do we need to put out, and what are those teachers, and what skills do they need to have? If we can make them hyper relevant because it's hyper local, that's an interesting retort. Yes.
I was just going to add to that, the idea of the teacher programming. We're going through a major hiring time right now, and one of the pieces that we're finding is that teachers aren't able to flip the conversation to the hyperlocal or to provide an example because they're in many cases are trained in a very broad program.
Right.
So I applaud you for working with Carlow and other education programs because right now, I think in many cases teachers don't know what they don't know, or at least they're coming out of programs that have not taught them to be creators or facilitators. That's still very much, our programs are very much industrial revolution based.
Right.
So what are we going to get? We're going to get an industrial revolution. That change isn't going to happen overnight. So we have also worked at our school with professors at CMU to think about developing classes that we become their prototype, right? So we become the beta, and then students also have a chance to get to know a human at the end of a project rather than just something that's really sexy like Bayer or something like a podunk school that doesn't really have any resources. It's a real world connection. So we're also trying to flip that switch to the folks that are creating the innovation at the higher academic level too. Schools as a facility to create more innovative communities, not just what's in our little walls.
What's interesting about that is, all those National Science Foundation grants that researchers like me get at the university, they all have a broader impacts section where people have to describe some kind of broader impact. They all have to do it. They simply don't know how to do it, and they don't know who to talk to do it authentically. So instead, they'll do something token. But they have to do it. And so you can meet a need that they actually have inside themselves, and they just don't have the tools and understanding for how to reach out and actually do it.
Once that spark happens, it creates a ripple effect. So then teachers start to see that it is possible. We were just talking about the visual. Once you create the visual for other educators, they get it. But it's very, it's difficult to change a system when you don't have an example of data right there in front of you.
That's right.
To speak to the higher ed and how we train the teachers, I'm from CalU. I'd love to talk to you about doing something through CalU. I actually just came back from the June Harvest Center.
Oh, excellent.
It's fantastic. Great.
Excellent.
But one of the big problems we have when we're looking at the way we change pre-service teachers is the requirements from the Pennsylvania Department of Education. And there are so many courses and materials that are crammed into the student's schedule.
Yeah.
If I go to my faculty and I say, oh, I got this cool thing, we should build a class, I can tell you right away they're going to lay on the floor and kick and scream. But as administrators and as higher ed, we have to think of it differently. So the way I think the best way to approach that is through professional development outside of what's built into the context. And I think the way we do that is we build collaboration with the IU units and the colleges that have the technology. And then what we do is we use the IU units to reach out to their districts they serve, but for our pre-service teachers, we include those in those PDs. And then as our pre-service teachers get trained in these different skill set, when we're looking to place them in a school, we place them in a school that's considering doing this, and then we're putting a content expert in there with them.
That's right.
If you look at the schools that have used, that have gone to where they've used a lot of the mobile devices, say iPads, the schools that have been extremely successful bring in people from Apple who stay with them for that full year of that implementation. So when the teachers want to change, there's someone there to guide them. And I think there's a great opportunity to use pre-service teachers as those consultants, where it's a double benefit. The pre-service teachers have a great benefit because they come to the classroom with value and not just sitting there watching.
Exactly. Perfect.
But in addition, it sort of gives that older senior veteran teacher a chance to explore every child and do things a little bit differently.
It gives them permission to reach out. It's
Exactly.
this pre-service teacher. I think it's the magic bullet. Actually, I think it's
agree.
a very important part of a solution path.
So how do you see the flipped classroom? The flipped classroom is a buzzword right now. It's really big. It's been around for a long time though. But a lot of faculty, I hear, that's how they're trying to employ the MOOC, is they want to be able to use the flipped classroom where they can sort of say, hey, look, this is material that's available for you, and we're going to talk about it in the classroom. So I built these short little video clips you're going to go through and do, and then we're going to bring it back in the classroom to have engaged conversations. Do you see that as, what's your take on that?
The math doesn't work. If all the teachers do flipped classrooms, there's not enough hours in the day for all the students to do the expected out-of-school work. That just, the math doesn't work. It just doesn't.
I was going to, well, I would have liked to shout out to the older, more veteran teachers to represent us Cougars that in fact, I would argue it's not age, that in some ways the younger teachers are more conservative.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in fact, perhaps it's not age, whatever. I mean, because now I'm just, people who are willing to take risks, and in a system that has not valued risk-taking, right? So perhaps we need to find a different variable. I don't necessarily think it's age. I think it is I think when you awaken the spirit of a child, that is when you're enlightened. And what can I do to continue to recognize and honor that voice? And anybody who's been touched in that way, I think that's the part that awakened me. But so on that end. On the other end, I also think the more is better. We need to shift away from the more is better, because we don't think about the implications of everybody flipping a classroom, but we also have too much to cover. You can't possibly, I believe in the awareness that, the building should be a classroom. I love the fact that you can, the emissions in the toilet, you can figure out, particles that are there and the air quality, that we have this rich environment right here that's exciting, instead of trying to cover loads and loads and loads of information. Perhaps if we create the capacity for awareness, and not just consumption.
Outstanding words. That's a perfect place to end. So first of all, I want to thank Dustin and the whole Sprout team for being the hosts of this, the Kids Creativity Network. I said creativity right that time. And you're outstanding. I mean, you have more than I have in terms of wisdom, so it's great to have a discussion with you all. So thank you for your attention. I hope we can do this again someday.